It's been a very eventful week for Sri Lanka. On the business front, the ratings agencies, the IMF, have welcomed the passage of the Inland Revenue Act, which was passed in Parliament last week. But on the international relations front, Sri Lanka is facing some challenges. The EU welcomed progress that Sri Lanka has made in advancing human rights and protecting human rights, but also warned of the need to address torture and to replace the Prevention of Terrorism Act with counter-terrorism legislation that is in line with international standards. Hello, good evening and welcome. This is Biz1st Review 360, your weekly roundup of the top business news and developments impacting the Sri Lankan economy. I'm Nadim Majid. Let's start with a look at this week's top stories.
The Brandix Group clinched the title, Sri Lanka's #1 exporter across all industries, at the 2016 Presidential Export Award held Thursday. Addressing exporters, Minister Malik Samaravikrama said exports have been stagnant in dollar terms from 2011 to 2016 and diversification should be the strategy to move forward.
As exports are a livelihood of our economy, especially since we have a limited domestic market. A particular challenge facing Sri Lanka is that our export basket is heavily concentrated on a few markets and a few products. A recent study has shown that 44% of Sri Lanka's exports are concentrated in just 3 markets: USA, European Union and India. So far, Sri Lanka has seen limited success in exporting to Asian markets such as Japan, China, South Korea, Hong Kong and so on. These 4 countries are among the top 10 markets for exports in the world, accounting for 20% of the global export market, but accounted for only 6% of Sri Lanka's exports. It is high time we made stronger inroads into the Asian markets. The Sri Lanka's 2 leading exports are not among the top 10 product categories traded in the world. In most of the Asian countries, the 2 key products fall within at least one of the top 5 products traded in the world. So this shows how much we have to do.
The Colombo Stock Exchange is to hold an investor forum in New York on the 16th of October in a bid to woo more institutional investors in the United States this year. The forum will feature a keynote address by the Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, while SEC Director General Mr. Vajira Vijay Gunawardena and CSE CEO Mr. Rajiva Bandaranayake will present on capital market regulation and the opportunities in the capital market respectively. The event will also feature a speech by CSE Chairman Mr. Ray Abewardena and a presentation on the experience of investing in Sri Lankan equities by Senior Portfolio Manager at Times Square Capital Management, Mr. Kagla Somek. The decision to host the Invest SL event in New York comes on the back of a considerable level of foreign activity in the stock market in 2017, where a net foreign inflow of 40 billion rupees has been recorded year to date in the primary and secondary markets. Foreign purchases during the first half of 2017 also established a record for the highest foreign purchases recorded in the first half of a calendar year. The year-to-date figure amounts to over 80 billion rupees. Investors from the US have consistently been the leading contributors to foreign turnover in the Sri Lankan stock market and have contributed to over 40% of the total foreign turnover since the year 2013.
Third Space Global, a UK-based online tutoring service, has opened a regional office in Colombo with the aim of training math tutors from Sri Lanka.
We want to help serve those who we work with. Third Space is working with UCL in London to develop an online teaching accreditation. But not just that, we want to also provide greater flexibility. We recognise that lots of our young Sri Lankans are studying and they need flexible work which will allow them to earn an income whilst they work hard to improve their job prospects.
Third Space Learning is building the world's first global and scalable teaching network of highly trained online tutors supported by cutting-edge technology. Third Space Learning offers the largest network of one-on-one math tuition in the UK. In the last 4 years, the company has worked with 16,000 children across 600 schools, delivering 200,000 plus teaching hours. It achieves this by recruiting young and intelligent Sri Lankans.
We believe that technology has the power to rapidly train and develop a global workforce. A global workforce that can help with the education of children all around the world. Last year we worked with 16,000 children across the UK. 55% of them were from disadvantaged backgrounds, 80% of them were at risk of academic failure. We're just getting going, but we've already shown that this global model of training tutors from around the world to help children in need works. Our goal now is to scale this into a global community using Sri Lanka as the hub for our talent.
Stay tuned to Biz1st Review 360. On the other side of this break, a discussion on the new Inland Revenue Act. Welcome back to the program. What does the new Inland Revenue Act hold in store for you? To talk about this and more, we brought into the studio this evening one of the country's foremost experts on taxation. He's the senior partner specializing in tax at EY. He is Mr. Duminda Hulangamu. Last week, the Inland Revenue Act was passed in Parliament, and the ratings agencies, the IMF, they all agree it's generally favourable, it's positive, it will improve government revenue collection. But what does this really mean for you, the taxpayer? Specifically, those paying income taxes. To talk about this and more, we have with us in the studio one of the country's foremost experts on taxation, Mr. Duminda Hulangamu. Mr. Hulangamu, thank you very much for coming on Biz1st Review 360. Can I ask you, do you agree with some of the projections that have been made by the ratings agencies, for example, that this will improve revenue collection or the revenue to GDP ratio to about 14.7% of GDP?
Thank you, Nadir, for inviting me yet again for a presentation at MTV. To answer your question, if the bill was passed as it was originally drafted, where there were very limited exemptions or rather nothing at all, and other than export of goods and services, education, agriculture and the semi-sector left at 12%, the rest of the tax rates going up to 28%, and capital gains be liable from day one. So if those original proposals were carried through, I'm sure there have been a substantial increase in government revenue. But I think the government quite rightly had to listen to the various stakeholders, such as the indirect exporters, then with the Colombo Stock Exchange, with regard to inherited property, the EPF. So all those stakeholders made submissions to government asking them not to tax those areas which have been either taxed at a lower rate or taxed not taxed at all, not to go the full hog and tax them. So with regard, as a result of giving to all the stakeholder views, etc., the final act that was passed was not as drastic. When I say drastic, I mean not as burdensome as it would have been than the original bill.
So the changes that were made were positive, and I
think changes that were made are positive from the point of view of the industries. It may not be positive from the government revenue collection point of view, but from the industry's point of view, it was positive. So because of that, I don't think there will be substantial increase in revenue in the numbers that the rating agencies have suggested. I think currently we are hovering at about 12.5% of GDP, and income tax collection currently is about 200 billion rupees. So from the 200 billion, I think they expect about 40 to 50 billion. I asked the Commissioner General, he said it's about 50 billion they're expecting. So it's about 25% increase. I think it's about 0.7 increase immediately. But if the industry, of course, independent of the Inland Revenue Act, if the economy grows, then the tax revenue will grow. So if there's a natural increase, then there might be an increase. But
let me put it to you this way. Is this a sustainable tax system that has been introduced?
No, I think it's sustainable to the extent that I don't think there's much of a difference between what we had and what we're having now. Except for the capital gains tax, which is a new tax that has been reintroduced after about 15 years. The other taxes are the same what we had. I mean, this is basically is income tax. It's just that the way you compute the tax, what you can claim as deductions, what you can claim as deductions for interest. I mean, there are some significant changes, but otherwise, the basic structure of taxable income, assessable income, losses, exemptions are continuing. So there is not much a structural change in my view to take it away from sustainability.
There was a notion spreading before there was a notion that was given out before this bill was introduced that this would streamline the tax procedure. It would make it easier for the taxpayer to pay their taxes. Has that happened?
Well, with the tax bill, I think the law is simpler to understand, no doubt, because you see, it's a new law. I think, as I mentioned in the previous programs I participated here, the law that we had is about 48 years old. So there are a number of amendments that were made to that law from the origin of it. Even the last bill that was passed 2006 to now, we had about 5-10 amendments. So you had to refer so many sections, and there were so many tax holidays, so many rates, so many slabs, so many exemptions. So it's very difficult for people to understand. But now this is a new law. So they have scrapped unnecessary areas, repugnant sections, and brought in new sections. And some sections are, of course, reasonably well done, I must say. The drafting is fairly good. So it should be simpler for them to understand and also to implement. But of course, implementation has two sides to it. One is the taxpayer of the department. So the department also must take time to study and understand. It must take some time. So there will be always issues on interpretation, etc. But I think, take it positively, I think it will make taxpayer friendly, more taxpayer friendly, to be simpler and easy to administer than what we had before. There's no doubt about that.
How does this affect income tax, this new law, specifically when it comes to salaried employees?
Yes, so salaried employees, the PAY, salaried employees are taxable at a maximum of 16%. Now it is going up to 24%. So those in the top bracket. So if you earn anything over 4.2 million rupees annum, you will go to the
top bracket.
Top bracket.
So that's 24%.
That's 24%. Up to that point is about 16% before. Also, employment income had various tax-free allowances. I mean, earlier there was 50,000 rupee, 200,000 rupee allowance per annum and 50,000 tax-free allowance on travelling. So what the government, they have consolidated the whole thing and taken up 1.3 million. So at the lower end, your tax actually effect will be less, impact will be less. But at the higher end, you pay more tax. Because earlier it was 600,000, it's about 1.3 million. So those who were paying tax earlier at about 100,000 will not now pay any tax at all. So at a lower level, it has given relief. But at a higher level, it has, of course, that is how income tax system will work, right? The higher you earn, more tax you pay. So in that context, it has gone in that direction.
Let me ask from the perspective, this is for my personal benefit, from the perspective of those involved in sort of freelance employment. How does the new tax law affect us, where you don't have a fixed monthly income, but it's variable? How does it affect?
Yeah, so freelancing income earlier was also considered to be independent services. So as a consultant or consultancy services, you would have been paying tax. If you reach a threshold of earlier 600,000 rupees, so that's a good question you asked earlier. As a freelance consultant, if you got 600,000 rupees, you would have not been paying any tax. Now, as a freelance consultant, you can have 1.3 million, you will not be paying tax. So earlier 50,000, now it's 100,000.
Okay,
right?
So it's moved from 600,000 to 1.3
million. And as a consultant earlier, you would have paid 24% higher rate anyway, if you were at that level. So that has been maintained. There's no reduction in that. So at a lesser level, it has gone up almost double as a tax-free allowance.
One of the key concerns that people have is taxes on food in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is one of the few countries in the world where you see really high taxes on food, on imported foods. Yeah. But most of our food we tend to import as well. How do you view this? Is this something that needs to change? Is it something that can be changed?
Yeah, it's like this. So if you take the basic food items like rice, dal, sugar, chili, or whatever that we import, there's mass consumption where ordinary people consume. I think the para tariffs are almost zero. Para tariffs plus the normal VAT and MBT are zero. But from time to time, the government might introduce cess or tariff in order to, if there's a glut in the market in Sri Lanka. So for example, we have excess production of rice or excess production of chili or excess production of something, then or vegetables or whatever, then they will impose a cess on imported goods to discourage imports so you can sell the local product. At the same time, if there's a shortage, then they might reduce the cess or whatever, so people can import it cheaper. So those essential items, I think, will vary depending on the market conditions and the consumer demand and the cost of living, etc. But if you take outside that the premium items, if you take the cheeses, the import of meat products, import of jams or whatever, those are at a very fairly significant tax rate. So whether it's right or wrong is a difficult question to answer, because the idea that again you tax the people who consume those which are the rich and then pass to the poor.
They considered luxury goods.
On the other hand, there are industries like the hotel industry, which makes use a lot of import of foods, because if you are in that industry, you have to cater to that industry. And most of the hotels, if you go to the breakfast tables or the buffet tables, are all import of food. So if you make it too expensive by imposing too much of duty, then the hotels can't afford to sell them at reasonable prices to their guests. Some hotel people not come there to have food, so it can have impact. So it
makes them less competitive.
Yeah. So I mean, there are two sides of the story always. You know.
So the trick is to achieve the point of balance.
Yeah, it's very difficult to balance it. Yeah.
Mr. Hulangamua, I also wanted to ask you about the tax base. This bill was supposed to broaden the tax base. It was also supposed to increase direct taxation as opposed to indirect taxation. One of the government's targets was 60% indirect taxation, 40% direct taxation. Is this bill a step in that direction? Will it take us there? Yeah. How far away are we from achieving it?
I think the objective is good. I think it will take us to some point in that direction. How much it is 40%, I can't tell you. I doubt tell immediately. But with regard to the tax base, yes, the tax base should increase as we go along, not immediately, because what this bill tries to achieve is that it says you can't give any more exemptions. So if you can't give any more exemptions either under BOI or any other law, this very law very clearly says after this law is comes into effect from 1st of April, that no other law or agreement can supersede this law and give any tax breaks unless they change it. So which means that everyone should come to the tax system. Once the existing exemptions and concessions are over, everyone will be paying tax. And if you look at, there were some exemptions which are not time bound, the IEEE exemptions, the double exemptions. I mean, there were so many exemptions that were there in the current law that evolved over a period of time. So they have done away with all the exemptions. Unless you want a BOI, where your holiday still remains, it will under the expiry of that agreement. But rest of it they have removed. So obviously there has to be an increase in the base. More people live in the tax system, more people pay income tax. And with the rates also being rationalized, I think there has to be an increase in income tax collection, there's no doubt. Whether it will go 40% immediately, I can't tell you, but it might go in that direction. But on the other hand, with regard to the tax
net, base, yeah.
The tax base is okay, but the tax net is where the people who don't pay tax, who are actually taxable and who don't pay. Now that is actually evasion. Now that a law can't look after. I mean, this law has very rigorous punishments, but I don't know how much it will be effective. But that is to do with administration. So the departments, Illinois department, the administration has to be strengthened to reach the maximum number of people. So that is a
So are you, one final question before I let you go, are you indirectly saying that the Inland Revenue Department currently lacks the capacity to implement this bill?
No, they can't, because they'll have to. No, I don't say that, but I think the Department of Inland Revenue, independent of implementing this act and its provisions, must also must be strengthened in terms of IT, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of manpower, and the resources required, the competence levels, the skill levels. Then beyond the department, there has to be interaction with other departments, more traffic department, the land registry, etc., where information flows in terms of the lifestyles of various people who don't pay tax. So that is a more administration issue which the government must look after. If that is strengthened, then definitely, in addition to the base, or remove exemption, net also can be widened. So that is something that happens.
So hopefully when Finance Minister Mangala Samaravira makes the budget speech this November, we'll be able to see some allocations being made for the Department of Inland Revenue.
I hope so, yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hulangamua, for coming on Biz1st Review. We touched a little bit on taxes on food products with Mr. Hulangamua. We have a more in-depth interview on Sri Lanka's practice of taxing food or high taxes on food coming up right after this short commercial break. Welcome back to the program. Singapore is a developed country with a per capita income of more than $20,000 per annum. By comparison, Sri Lanka, a developing country, and our per capita GDP is still less than $4,000 per annum. But did you know that chicken is cheaper in Singapore than it is in Sri Lanka. Why does Sri Lanka have such high taxes on food? To talk about this and more, Newsfirst Shahin Jurangpati sat down with Ravi Ratnasabapathy, a research fellow at the Advocata Institute, a liberal policy think tank.
Now, there's certain countries you mentioned where people come in from, like Paris, China, and so on and so forth. Cost of living there in those countries are also pretty much high. So when they come to a country like Sri Lanka and when they complain that the cost of living is high, what do we make of it? How do we respond?
Yes, it's quite surprising when people say this, but some of the prices, not everything, but some of the items are in fact very expensive because we have very heavy taxes on a lot of items, including, I'm afraid to say, a lot of basic food items.
So what has Advocata, your institute, done? What is the extensive work that you all have done on food taxing? Tell our viewers how much it costs to bake a cake, because like you said, butter, cheese, these are semi-luxury food items.
Right. We actually did an exercise of trying to make a butter cake, and we found that about 35% or about a third of the cake is actually being eaten by the government. If we go back to this question of comparative food prices and government policy, if you look at chicken, you will be surprised to know that chicken is actually cheaper in the retail shops in Singapore than it is in Colombo.
You have to mention the fact that Singapore is also a country which some people say has a massive cost of living itself.
Yes, and a kilo of chicken from Fair Price, which is a big supermarket chain there, costs $2.85, which works out about 412 rupees here. In Sri Lanka, chicken retails for 425 rupees a kilo for the whole chicken. I took that from the website of a popular supplier here. Now, if you look at chicken breast, now Malaysia is a lot cheaper, right? Chicken breast, which a lot of people take because it's convenient and you don't need to clean the chicken and all that. In Sri Lanka, it's about 670 rupees a kilo. But from Tesco's in Malaysia, you can buy it for 470 rupees, right? Very significantly cheaper, almost 50% cheaper than Sri Lanka. If you look at wheat flour, that's we talked about rice earlier, and the fact that the government, when we retail at 90 rupees or 100 rupees a kilo, there was 50 rupees tax on that, on any imported rice. The second most important cereal is wheat. We eat a lot of bread, buns. In Malaysia, a kilo of wheat flour will cost you 49 rupees. In Sri Lanka, it retails for 92 rupees. Now, the reason for that is that there's a massive tax, 85% tax on wheat flour imports. Wheat grain is taxed at a much lower rate, at 23% or so. But what the differential basically is retained by the millers, not so they make a large, what is called economic rent. The anomalies in the tax system allow certain businesses to profit enormously from these taxes. So these are the reasons for high cost of living. I spoke of some of the other items there. So what we've done is we've set up a tracker on our Advocata web page, where we track the prices of most of the, at least a sample of items, popular items, and have the taxes there, so people have an understanding of how much tax goes into their basic food products. And the question they need to ask is, okay, what does the government do with the tax money that they collect?
Ravi, now we were talking about price of chicken in Singapore and in Sri Lanka. Why is there a massive difference in prices? I mean, there is just chicken. It can't be a special kind of chicken in Singapore.
Right, but what happens is the principal raw materials for chicken is maize and soybean. Both are taxed very highly. I had the figure with me. Soybeans are taxed at 45%, maize at 90%. So the net result is when the ingredients cost a lot, the end product costs a lot. So that's the reason for that. Just as the high tax on wheat flour is what causes the bread price to remain high here, bread and any wheat-based product. Now we could, as I said, advocate for cutting off all the taxes on food, which would significantly lower the cost of living. But the question is, how does the government cover the drop in revenue? Now that is something that needs to be looked at. Out of every rupee that the government takes from a consumer as tax, if they give back an equal value in terms of services, valuable services, then there is no loss from the perspective of a citizen. But if any of that money is wasted or spent inefficiently, then there is a loss. So it's better to keep the money in the hands of the citizen than the government take it and lose it.
So you're saying that the government does not give its proper return for the taxpayers' money?
Yes. If you cut your taxes on food, you bring down the cost of living. But then that needs to be matched by an equal cut in government expenditure if you are not to end up with a bigger budget deficit. Right now, the question is, where do you cut? Okay, one area is this state-owned enterprises, because we've by coincidence the amount of tax collected from special commodity levy is almost exactly equal to the losses amongst the big SOEs. So that's a nice comparison to do. So if you don't have those enterprises, then you need not have lost that or spent that money, and that money could have been returned to consumers in the form of lower food prices. But there are other methods also that the government can look at. A general improvement in the efficiency of government in delivering actual return, in measuring its performance, in delivering its return to customers, that by measuring and monitoring the efficiency of government, they may be able to cut down on waste and other losses and fund tax cuts that way.
And that's a wrap of Biz1st Review 360 for this week. Don't forget to look us up on Facebook. You'll find us at Biz1st Review 360. I'm Nadim Majid, wishing you good night and good luck.